Does the dopamine chase lead to more pleasure or pain? Danny, you're a fashion designer and a printmaker. You look so bright and sunny. What inspires your work?
My work is really inspired by sparking joy in the everyday. It's bright colours and really fun, poofy, feminine shapes and just things that really feel good to wear.
The clothes you wear, do you give that a name?
I definitely feel like I can identify with dopamine dressing.
Why do you associate your sense of style with dopamine?
My understanding of dopamine is that it is a feel-good chemical, and I can totally relate to struggling with dopamine through the lens of like social media, using too much social media. I would love for the way I dress to be a positive alternative to, scrolling on your phone. And I love the idea that dressing colourfully can be a fun, creative alternative.
Nick, you're Danny's partner. Are you also a dopamine dresser?
I don't know. I think Danny sort of inspired me a little bit to have a bit more fun with clothes. Like, we both really like dressing up, like costumes, going to costume parties and that kind of thing. And I mean, Danny's not wearing a costume, but you can have fun with costumes, right? Make people laugh, have conversations about them. And so, wearing a nice pair of pants sometimes gets you a compliment and that turns into a conversation. And so I think I can vibe with that part of dopamine dressing.
When you're going out together, how do people respond to Danny when they see her beautiful clothes?
I think my favourite is seeing little kids, like, just being like, and pointing at Danny, and then tugging on their parent's sleeve or something like that, and being like, "Is that a unicorn?"
Yeah.
Oh, really? That's so lovely.
Legitimately, a little girl was like, "Is that a unicorn?" And so that's really special.
Are there ways that you chase dopamine in your line of work?
Yeah. So in a kind of a very different way, I'm an archaeologist, and so there's a number of different elements to chasing dopamine there. It's not snakes and whips and punching Nazis. From that Indiana Jones perspective. But the real life of an archaeologist is more to that realistic sort of seeking little bits of dopamine here and there. So I love finding things. That's why I'm drawn to archaeology. And dopamine, I understand, is a bit of it's a motivation and encouragement chemical. And so is that maybe a stone tool down there in the dirt? It just gives you a little boost. And then if it is, and it's a really nice stone tool, it's a really good feeling.
Zoe, you became interested in neuroscience a few years ago. What sparked that?
Been a little bit confused by my impulses. I've had a long-standing sugar addiction and just kind of really exploring that a little bit. And also I'm a coach, so understanding my clients was became part of my training to get into that as well. I just found it fascinating. The more I dig into it, and still now I'm always listening to podcasts and reading books and trying things out and experimenting with things just to see what the impact is on the brain. I find it really interesting and fascinating.
Apart from craving sugar, what other impulses were you driven by?
I do love a good op shop hunt. So going around op shopping and just getting the find was a big one. Scrolling, obviously. TikTok was a big one at that point. Games as well, and it was really lame. Now I've kind of gone into slightly more highbrow games. There's now New York Times puzzles. But before it was solitaire. It was just so embarrassing.
Anastasia, you've written a book about dopamine that's been translated into 8 languages. Why is there so much interest in this topic?
People are wanting to understand how the brain and body work and want to understand their behaviours more so. We might be able to observe a specific behaviour, like I feel pulled to play games on my phone or scroll social media, but I think people are wanting to understand the science behind why that is. And so hopefully through this dissemination of this kind of scientific information and knowledge, people can gain those insights to be able to make more informed decisions and choices for themselves. Things like dopamine activation and any kind of chemical processes that happen in the brain and the body are often happening at a level that's not at our conscious awareness. We don't realise it's happening. So having information, knowledge about how this all works can help people make those choices and decisions for themselves.
Let's look at what dopamine actually is.
Dopamine is one of the brain's neurotransmitters. It's involved in several of the body's functions, including contributing to our pleasure, motivation and reward systems. From an evolutionary perspective, dopamine is essential. Every time you seek something to survive, for example food, dopamine positively reinforces you to seek it again later. That's why dopamine is crucial for developing habits. But not all habits are positive, sometimes leading to addiction. Modern-day humans seek more than just basic survival needs. We desire stimulus, accomplishments and relationships. Technology, social media apps and other modern conveniences make these things easier to find, but the impact of modern life and dopamine is still up for debate.
Carly, you're a neuroscientist. We've heard dopamine plays a role in our reward systems. How does it work?
Yeah, so dopamine's often thought of as being this pleasure chemical in the brain because of its links with reward and happiness. But we know from neuroscience research that it's more complicated than that. So we see dopamine firing or being released in the brain when a reward is unexpected. But over time, as you're able to predict that reward, that level of dopamine drops off. So that when you can perfectly predict something, we actually don't see dopamine neurons firing. And then if you don't get something you predict, we actually see a dip in dopamine. So dopamine is really providing this teaching signal that allows us to learn about what's happening in the environment so that we can update our behaviour so that we can do more of the things that lead to reward and reduce the behaviours that aren't being rewarded anymore. And what's really neat in this phenomenon is that as that signal to dopamine or that dopamine release that occurs with reward decreases, what happens is the cues that predict that reward see a greater increase in dopamine. So the dopamine neurons start firing to the cues or the things in your environment that are predicting that a reward is about to happen. And so those cues start to become the releases of dopamine. So you might imagine seeing the golden arches, and I might get excited because I know what that means. And so the dopamine release is really happening when I see those cues rather than when I'm eating my McFlurry later.
Anastasia, you're a psychologist. If dopamine can drive behaviours, are some dopamine triggers better than others?
Yes, I mean, dopamine in and of itself is neither good nor bad. We need it for evolutionary purposes in order to survive. But typically, if we are putting effort into the task that we are doing and we're having that dopamine reward and activation at the end of that, that is a healthier way to activate dopamine compared to things that are very quick and easy and don't require any effort. So, for example, if I have a veggie garden and I want to grow some cucumbers and tomatoes, I have to put effort into tending to the garden. I have to have patience and commitment, and I'll get the reward of having those, delicious vegetables at the end. That is a healthier way to have dopamine activated, and I have that kind of reward at the end, versus things that are very quick and easy, like scrolling through social media, pulling out my phone, placing a bet, playing a poker machine, something like that.
Anna, you rock climb for fun. Can you talk us through how you're feeling when you're hanging up there?
This particular climb I found quite difficult because it was maybe the hardest thing I had done at that time, and you have to place your own pieces of gear as you go. And I didn't have a whole lot of trust in my placement, so it was quite scary and challenging in a mental sense, but I had very good guidance, so I was very safe, and it was more mental.
So when you're feeling fearful or insecure, and I understand you had a fall a few years ago, how do you kind of coach yourself through that when you're out there on that rock?
It's so specific to the climb, but I think how I coach myself through fear is often through a mantra of just being like, I am safe, like I am prepared. And sometimes I just don't. If I feel too afraid, I will backtrack and then restart and get to a point where I do feel comfortable and I can do it safely without being afraid. Because when you're afraid, that is when things go wrong, I find.
If there is that sense of fear, what keeps you coming back to it?
It's really interesting listening to the neuroscience side of things, because maybe it is that type 2 fun, the dip, it's so challenging and it's so difficult, but you get to the top and you've achieved something that was really difficult and you feel amazing, you feel strong.
Marley, how would you describe yourself growing up in Moree in northern New South Wales?
Well, I probably thought I was a regular kid growing up in the country. Lots of swimming in rivers, running around. Like the Steely, there was this bridge that we used to jump off. It was quite high, and we used to jump off that quite a bit. Motorbikes. We had a motorbike track just down the end of the street. Moved to the coast, started skating, surfing.
Did your need for thrills have other consequences?
Yeah, unfortunately they came with a few other consequences. Things, I guess trauma and stuff as a kid and addiction, being around that kind of shifted over into that dopamine and chasing it that way.
Can you let us know any of those things that you might have done, or if you feel comfortable?
Like around the coast and stuff,
Yeah.
well, not proud of it, but just like, I guess, crime side of things, like stealing cars, breaking into houses, like all that. Started off stealing little things at shops and schools, and then just, it was more that rush, like I wasn't a career criminal at all, but that rush, I like it.
In your early 20s, you discovered skydiving. What was your first jump like?
I still remember it like it was yesterday. It was a little Cessna 182, so it's basically like a little tin can, five skydivers at a time. Door open, that's when it gets real, the wind, the noise. You're strapped to the instructor and he's giving you a few instructions, okay, legs out, holding on, head back. I've pretty much done none of that. I was looking down at the ground, just going, holy crap, I'm about to jump out of a plane.
Wow.
But a part of me was like, I can't wait.
How did you feel when you finally made it to the ground?
I was buzzing off that rush, and I was like, where do I learn?
Skydiving involves up to a minute of free fall before the parachute opens. What is that minute like?
Bliss. Even though you're racing through the sky, nearly a couple hundred k's, like kilometres an hour, it's peaceful.
Really?
It's quiet. You're in the moment.
Carolyn, you're Marley's wife. Would you say you're also a thrill seeker?
No, I'm the polar opposite to Marley.
Really?
Yes.
Have you ever gotten into skydiving or anything like that yourself?
Yeah, 14 years ago, a bit more than that, I travelled to New Zealand and I always wanted to go for a skydive, so that's what I did there. I went for a tandem, that's where we met. He was my instructor, but he was just there. So yeah, I jumped out and I liked it so much. I was terrified, don't get me wrong. It's like really, like you have to push through. But I was strapped to someone else, he took care of everything else, and we jumped out, and that was just, I love that. So maybe in that sense I was a thrill seeker there. I went straight for another tandem, done a second one, and I thought maybe I should do this myself. So I signed up for the solo course and done that. But I'm not a risk taker, I'm not a thrill seeker, and I just started overthinking things. So when you learn how to skydive, obviously you need to learn the things that can go wrong and what you do in that case, and that just freaked me out. And then just the fact that it made me that nervous. So when I had that question in my head myself, like in this scenario, what would you do? And I didn't have the answer. Then I just started not trusting myself, and that's when I thought maybe it's not for me.
Carly, does dopamine play a role in our decisions around risk-taking?
There's the fear, the stress, all of these feelings that, which are rightly so when you're jumping out of a plane, and you're weighing that up against the reward. And so different people's brains operate this balance differently. And so we see some people being more sensation seekers. They're driven by this chase of reward and excitement and novelty, which are more likely to take risks in these kinds of circumstances.
Simon, last weekend, like many of us, you ran an ultra marathon, a 160-kilometre race, which took you 32 hours. How are you feeling?
Surprisingly, I actually feel pretty good.
Really?
Yeah, the body held up very well. I went into it with an Achilles injury on my right ankle, but we pushed through it, and I've got another run in 2 weeks. So
wow. Another ultra marathon?
It will end up being an ultra marathon. It's a longest mile race. Hardcore Harry's is setting it up. So what's actually going to happen is every lap, the cut-off time diminishes until there's only one person left. So
wow.
I'm assuming I'll probably get to about 80, 90 Ks, looking at the times. But see how we go.
A standard marathon is 42 kilometres. Why is that not enough for you?
Because I'm a little bit up. So the distance has never really mattered for me. It's always been about getting to that point where quitting feels like the only option. And once you reach that point, that's where I feel like resilience is really built. When you're able to push through when everything in your body tells you to stop, the lessons that you learn from something like that, you can then take on into everyday life. And myself, I'm positive. I know that I never quit when things get hard. because I've done these sorts of runs.
Would you say that you've always had a bit of a personality that sort of wants to keep striving and pushing?
Yes. There is a bit of an addiction to trying to find that limit. You know what I mean? I've always, since I started running a couple of years ago, the goal has always been to find my own limit. And the runs have gotten bigger and bigger over time, and I still have never quit a race, so I still feel like I've never found that limit.
You said you've just been running for a couple of years.
So about 3 years ago, I was pretty overweight, and I would chase dopamine through other vices, the quick fix, the social media, drugs, alcohol, just whatever I could do to get that fix in the moment, although it would make me feel terrible after it. Didn't really matter for me back then. Whereas now with running, it's kind of switched to I go low in the moment with running, and then after it, the high is just incredible.
Steph, you make online content about budgeting. Why?
I think it started very much as just a hobby. And I very quickly realised through my own journey of trying to get better with budgeting and impulse spend less that people just don't talk about money. It's so awkward. And I think we're kind of worse off for it as a culture because everything's so taboo. You get stuck in shame thinking you're the only one struggling. And I found that, sharing my husband's journey on trying to get better with money definitely was eye-opening to see how many people shared the same struggle.
You and your partner thought you were sticking to a budget, but you found yourself kind of going over it every month. What was making you go over?
It's a lot of little things, and it really ended up being a lot of that kind of dopamine chasing. You know, if you had a bad day, let's get takeout. You know, if you are wanting to feel better in some kind of way, there's always some kind of way that money could fill that void. You go to the shops and everything is set up to get you to buy, and the Aldi special buys aisle, I mean, come on. So, a little bit of everything.
You now use a dumb phone, which doesn't have any apps on it. Why is that?
It really was just kind of a natural progression. So my husband and I did 2 no-buy years where we didn't buy anything that wasn't necessary. And that really made us analyze our habits a lot. And I think just progressing on from that, I kind of started to realize that what was driving me to spend was also driving me to scroll. And I did not have the discipline to just stop, so I went for a dumb phone.
Annette, you live in Dubbo in the central west of New South Wales. What sort of relationship do you have with your smartphone?
I think I have a really good relationship with my smartphone. I hope I'm not kidding myself, but I'm very clear about why I use it, and I feel that I use it to enhance my life. I'm definitely there to connect with real people. I have a rare genetic condition. I'm legally blind and I'm a guide dog user. So those 3 things create a lot of challenges in life. And I feel that I use my smartphone and social media to connect with other people who face the same challenges, because the people around me don't have those challenges and don't understand them. So, you know, I wonder whether my dopamine chasing is a cocktail of dopamine and oxytocin or something, because it's about the connection with real people for me.
Carly, we hear about dopamine hits from scrolling social media. You're a neuroscientist. Is that actually what's happening in our brains?
Yeah, so if we think about dopamine being released when we see things that are unpredictable, that's exactly what scrolling is, right? You're just looking and getting all of this new content. You don't know what's coming next. And the algorithm is making sure that the stuff you're seeing is the stuff you like. So there's also this association with things that have previously been rewarded, whether it's food or friends or shopping, or these things that have triggered dopamine for you in the past are the things that are probably popping up in your scroll in an unpredictable manner. So it's kind of the perfect storm for having a dopamine release.
Zoe, has dopamine affected the way you form habits?
Yes, I got diagnosed with ADHD 4 years ago. And so basically I have a low dopamine deficiency from the outset with ADHD, so I'm always craving dopamine.
Had you suspected that maybe you had ADHD but you weren't sure, or?
No, because I think there wasn't really, it's been the last 5 years, I think there's been a lot kind of more around it from a social media point of view, and that's really, for me, it was TikTok. So it's interesting that the thing I was getting dopamine from told me that I had a dopamine deficit.
Yeah, isn't that funny?
Yeah, it was really impactful, and more as I was getting older towards perimenopause, that was getting worse. So being able to kind of say like, oh, it's this, and these are the things you can do to support that, and these are definitely the ways you can be more kind about yourself, were really significant.
Anastasia, how is dopamine related to ADHD?
This is an interesting question because there's certainly a lot of research and literature emerging at the moment, particularly as ADHD has become more and more recognised. One of the things we know is that it was originally thought that dopamine and ADHD were related in the sense that people had an underproduction or deficit of dopamine. We now know it's a little bit more complicated than that. And actually what we see is, rather than just simply a deficit, actually a dysregulation in the way that dopamine is activated, particularly in relation to the prefrontal cortex, so the part of our brain that helps us make decision and plan, but also the reward centers. So what that dysregulation can look like is dysregulation in terms of dopamine being activated, the levels at which it's maintained in the brain, but also then a person actually being able to disengage from something they're doing and turn their attention to something else. So in the same way that we see, for example, people struggle to sometimes maintain attention, we also see the opposite, where people become hyperfixated and hyperfocused and then actually struggle to take their attention away from something and redirect. So it really comes down to this dysregulation factor. And a lot of the people, at least that I have seen clinically, who present with an addiction may often actually have undiagnosed ADHD, and they throughout their life have found ways to kind of regulate themselves when they have a brain that is in some ways dysregulated.
Carly, does dopamine play a role in other disorders or diseases?
There are changes in the dopamine system in many different conditions, and dopamine has many functions. It's not just in reward, it's also really important for movement. So one other condition that we know about is in Parkinson's. There are neurons that produce dopamine that are degraded, or we have cell death in these pathways, and that causes movement deficits. So people with Parkinson's are often able to move in a direction, but then when they go to change direction or change their action, they'll kind of get a bit stuck, and that's because of the lack of these dopamine neurons. So dopamine has many functions and is implicated in many different conditions.
Glenn, you were diagnosed with Parkinson's disease about 8 years ago.
That's correct.
What led you to seek a diagnosis?
Well, it first started, I was just driving the car and my thumb started tapping away on the steering wheel. And over a period of a few weeks, that was getting more prevalent. And so I went to the doctor and they said, oh, it's probably just a nervous reaction, or we'll send you for a brain scan, and then I had a nerve test. All those sorts of things were ruled out, and then suggested I see a neurologist to see if I may be having an onset of Parkinson's, which it was hard to find one that would, because it's so difficult to diagnose, I had to find one that said, yes, you do have Parkinson's, which was very upsetting because I wanted to know, yes, do I have to deal with this or no, I don't? It was a kick in the stomach, actually. It's ripped my self-worth out of me now that I have to rely on assistance and help. I was a very independent man and strong growing up, and yeah, it's debilitating at times.
Robin, you're Glenn's wife. What did you notice when he started taking medication for his Parkinson's?
When he started taking the medication, he seemed to settle in his shaking. He seemed to be a little bit more focused. He was suffering from nightmares, something fierce, you know, shaking and screaming out and kicking out and all the rest of it. But that seemed to settle it a bit, but it progresses. It progresses.
After that initial medication, doctors put him on a different medication. What was that?
He was given an additional one because of the nightmares that is known as an agonist. It supports the levodopa. And he was put on that for a while, and that also helped, but that then sort of faded in significance. And so the doctor did increase the dosage of that particular agonist, and it did cause issues.
Glenn, what did you notice when you started taking more of that dopamine agonist drug?
I developed some bad habits and some obsessions, mainly gambling. I'd see a horse race and I'd want the thrill of it winning and betting on it. I wanted more of it. I had this constant thoughts of sex as well, which never entered my mind prior to that. Trying to get that out of my head, I couldn't get rid of it. It was just obsessive thoughts.
Robin, did you notice that change in your husband?
I did. Glenn's sleeping pattern changed quite a lot on this additional dosage. He'd gamble on the poker machines on his iPad through the night, or watch, go to sort of some porn sites, that sort of stuff. The specialist did warn us that could become a problem with increasing the dosage. So once I became aware of it, that's when we started to speak to the neurologist and told him, he said, take him off it straight away and come back to the original dose that he was on. And things started to improve. So it really was an eye-opener of what this additional dose could do to a person. Changed him completely.
Carly, is it common to experience compulsions as a result of taking these medications?
Yeah, so these agonists, which mimic dopamine, so they kind of act like dopamine in the brain, cause about 15 to 20% of people with Parkinson's to experience these impulse control disorders. And so that can lead to all of these other side effects, like what you're describing. Because of that increase in dopamine, it's mimicking dopamine in these reward centres, which is separate to the motor symptoms that we're trying to treat.
Right, so it's basically every single part of your brain's been sort of turned up, the volume's up.
Yeah, you're taking it and it's affecting your whole body when you take these drugs systemically, which makes treatment really difficult. This is why we try to do research to understand how these different compounds work and how we can make them more targeted to avoid side effects, and to try to really emphasise the individuality as well. Dosage is important and different treatments work for different people.
Sonia, last year you started taking a GLP-1 injectable weight loss drug. Why was that?
I got diagnosed with adenomyosis and also uterine cancer, and had to have a full hysterectomy to cure that. And the problem with that was I was weighing around 93, 94 kilos, so, and I'd had previous caesarean sections, so it put me in a high-risk category for surgery, and the solution was at that time to lose weight. So I was put on Mounjaro for the purpose solely of losing the weight, having the surgery. My goal was to have it as quick as possible. Obviously, you get a diagnosis like that, you just want to have the surgery as quick as you can. So I lost 20 kilos within about 6 months and had the surgery, and then I was cleared of those conditions.
You decided to stay on the medication after the surgery. Why was that?
I've got a very high stressful job as a deputy principal, but also mother, wife. I have 2 teenagers. That's a lot. And I used to drink a lot. So for about 10 years, I used to drink 1 or 2 bottles of wine a night. I was probably what they call a functioning alcoholic. I'd get up every day and go to work. I functioned as an adult. And I noticed fairly quickly after taking the medication, when I was going to have my routine glass of wine, I had a few sips and I didn't want it. And I didn't think about it too much. That was unusual for me, but I just tipped it down the sink and went about my business. The bottle was still in the fridge because I wasn't going to throw that out. And then 3 days later, I realised that the bottle was still in the fridge and thought, oh, I'm going to have a glass of wine. Found that I didn't want it. And then I never drank again, and I still haven't 12 months later. I can't explain it other than it was like a switch in my brain had just clicked, and the desire for alcohol just completely went away. I still have a stressful career. I still have 2 gorgeous teenagers and a husband and all those lovely life challenges and stresses. But for some reason, I just never think that having a drink of wine is the answer. I just don't do it. I just don't think about it. It doesn't enter my brain.
Carly, is there any link between GLP-1 medications and a reduction in addictive behaviour?
Yeah, so this has been something that's been noted by many people, and research is starting to look at what happens in people that are on these GLP-1 medications and those that aren't. But some of the early studies have shown that these GLP-1 receptors are in your gut, and so they have these effects on diet and eating, but they also are in your brain and there are in the reward circuits. It might be helping to kind of prevent these big spikes in dopamine, kind of muffling those high dopamine peaks that you might be getting from addictive substances or the cues around them, so that it helps people to not feel that craving or that urge to have to indulge in those substances.
Simon, these days you compete in ultra marathons. What was life like before you took up running?
I felt very lost. Growing up, being young, I always had a very good family, and they always supported me any way that they could. But having that pressure to succeed from coming from a successful family, I feel like kind of pushed me down the path to do the opposite. And I started using drugs and alcohol very heavily, drinking every day, drugs constantly. If it wasn't every weekend, it was during the week as well. Running eventually was able to give me that escape from all that.
How did you turn things around from that drug addiction to seeking the natural high?
There was no real moment where things switched. Obviously, I was going down that very dark path, and there was some times where I was like, I really need to get out of this. But then it was through small wins, incrementally. So it started with the weight loss. Obviously, I've actually lost about 40 kilos. So I started with the weight loss, and then once I was able to get some momentum with that, I actually didn't get into a gym until I was about 23 years old, which is only a couple of years ago. And from there, training, just feeling better about myself day to day. That then eventually led me into running, and running for me felt like the most measurable way to see how far I had come from where I was. And still to this day, when I look back at the person I was only 2.5 years ago to now, it's absolutely mind-blowing what it's done for me.
Talia, you were 18 when you first tried speed at a party. What was that like for you?
It was exciting, and the process of doing it made me feel cool and like I belonged. And I guess, yeah, that did everything that I needed it to do at the time. Like I did it once, and then I did it for the next 10 years. And it was pretty much every day. Towards the end, it was more of the habit. So I smoked amphetamines, and so the cues of actually what that looks like was actually what I was chasing rather than the high, because the high didn't impact me anymore. It was just to function throughout the day. It was the process of smoking.
Did anyone around you know how bad it had gotten for you?
I like to tell myself that they didn't. I was high functioning for long periods of time, so I had really good jobs, went to university, maintained relationships with my family. I like to think that I hid it quite well. I don't think someone would have hired me to work in a financial institution if they knew that I was smoking ice in the bathroom. But yeah, I like to think that I hid it quite well, and then that obviously fooled myself into thinking that I didn't need to change because I was, fine and working and participating in the community. So yeah, I like to say that people didn't know, but my parents tell me that they knew, but they couldn't stop me. I was unreachable.
Yeah, right. When did that change, that sort of sense of functioning?
So I would have periods of high functioning, and then you can only go so far when you're smoking every single day, but then something would happen and then there would be a crash, and then I would be really dysfunctional and, couch surfing, hotel hopping, in violent relationships, unemployed, really desperate, and then I would seem to get it together again and then be high functioning again. But it ended in me having one of those crashes and not being able to get myself back out, and I ended up making the really poor decision to sell drugs, and then that landed me in prison.
Marley, you said you found skydiving addictive. What happened 5 years ago?
Yeah, well, I'll probably say my life split into two. Had an injury from skydiving, just a landing, the way I was sliding, ended up breaking my left tib and fib. That was first injury in skydiving. That was, over 15 years of jumping and having fun. And then the next day, my wife goes into labour.
Wow.
So I may or may not had something to do with that.
Triggered the labour. Carolyn, is that how you remember it?
Yeah, I remember on the day, I just got home from shopping or something, and a friend of ours from the drop zone stood in front of the door, and I thought, what's going on? And then she's like, so he's all right. And I'm like, okay. And then so I slowly learned what happened, but I actually felt quite calm. Like I thought, because I was 38 weeks pregnant at that time, and I thought, oh, we still have 2 weeks roughly, like first time pregnant as well. Like I thought we have 2 weeks time to figure things out, no problem. Weirdly, I felt calm, but probably subconsciously at 4 a.m. the next morning, I thought, oh, what's that?
Wow.
Yeah, so I went into labour, but we had incredible friends and colleagues who all helped out. So they came actually with a skydiving bus to pick me up and Marley so he could put his leg up.
Oh, wow.
Drove us to the hospital. Yeah, it was amazing, yeah.
Marley, you couldn't skydive for around 5 months?
Yeah.
What was that time like when you couldn't do what you loved?
It's pretty rough. Having a addictive personality and high sensation seeker, I've been abusing drugs and alcohol for a long time, and same with the painkillers.
So you're not getting that dopamine hit from skydiving?
Yeah, from jumping every day for nearly 15 years.
And
it was a big part of my life, just to numb that, I guess.
Carolyn, what was that period like for you?
Obviously, first-time parents, like everything's new, like that by itself is stressful already. But weirdly enough, that wasn't the biggest challenge. So the biggest challenge was actually dealing with Marley and his, like, that he couldn't skydive, what he just explained. So then falling into that hole, it was very difficult because I had to not only deal with the baby, but then also managing his moods and to get around those. So I would probably describe it as probably the most difficult time in my life, yeah.
Marley, what was the impact on your relationship?
It was hard. It was stressful.
And you guys sort of split up for a while so you could sort of try and get yourself together.
Actually moved out.
How have you felt sort of since then? You know, if you felt like you've been able to kind of get yourself a bit more back on track?
Yeah, I guess dealing with it, being in those moments, in those dark places in your mind. I said to myself I never want to go back there again, but being there I've learned a lot about myself and about those situations and how to handle them a bit better and try and stay out of that space.
So you try and get your dopamine in other ways?
Yeah, playing with the kids, building cubbies and playing hide and go seek.
Carolyn, what's it like being married to a risk taker? It's ups and downs. So with Marley skydiving, for example, like it's, we moved around a lot. So it's, we got to places, met great people. So that's a really positive side of things. So it's definitely not boring. The challenging part starts when he doesn't get his dopamine hit, I would say, because then you start managing the addictional side, and so it takes up a lot of space in the relationship just to attend to that. So it's a bit imbalanced, I think. And I said in the beginning that I'm not a risk taker, but I think I took a risk in marrying a thrill seeker. So.
I had my first horse ride when I was 7. And from then on, I was just like crazy horse girl. I've been riding horses for 21 years. I feel like riding after as long as I have. It's so second nature. I wouldn't describe horse riding as thrill-seeking or getting a rush. Exposing yourself and the horse to these stunts. It's always there, that awareness of the danger and the explosivity of certain horses, but it's so subconscious because I've been doing it for so long. You can plan a day, but things are always changing. The animals, they're always adapting, and so you have to adapt. I think it's so often the connection and the partnership you get with working with animals on the ground or on its back. It requires a lot of trust, mutual trust. They feel your nervous system through your seat bones. So you can't really fake it. You can't fake the calm, you have to be calm. I really enjoy the presence that being on the horse's back gives me. Your mind can't be elsewhere. You have to be so present with what you're doing, and you wouldn't want to be elsewhere. No, I don't think I can get that feeling anywhere else.
Anna, you rock climb, you horse ride, you're also a stunt woman. Have there been periods when your body couldn't keep up?
Yes, actually I had one quite recently. At the beginning of the year I had glandular fever, and I just had to stop. I was training 4 times a week and rock climbing on the weekends and riding whenever I could, and I had to stop for a time.
What was that like for you, stopping and not being able to do what you love?
It was so hard. It was really difficult. I would try to get back to things too quickly and then need to dial it back again and rest, and it really taught me to listen to my body.
Did you find yourself sort of trying to seek that dopamine from other places?
Yeah, certainly. I started doing more acting classes, and then you get that kind of reassurance that you're progressing and doing something productive in that sense. And I watched lots of movies and binge watched some TV shows for sure.
Do you ever get bored?
I get bored, but I think I have so many interests and hobbies. I actually have this box in our garage that my partner calls the hobby box, and it's just got all of my like old scuba diving gear or punching things or sticks or bow and arrow. Like I don't know, I feel like I'm always picking up different things. I play instruments, so I do feel boredom, but I think I have a diverse interest.
Anastasia, is there a connection between dopamine and boredom?
So I guess when we're talking about boredom, we're talking about this kind of felt experience where there is a sense of understimulation and the brain is kind of craving some sort of mental or sensory input, and that doesn't match what the environment is able to give us at that point in time. And so what we see is that often in these states, they're quite uncomfortable. It doesn't feel particularly good to feel bored. So this is when we are particularly vulnerable to perhaps being pulled to some of those more dopamine-driven behaviours. So we might reach for like a sugary treat, or we might binge watch some telly, or we might have a glass of wine. We might do something to give us some sort of stimulation that helps kind of relieve that emotion of boredom in the moment. But the thing is that boredom is actually quite a normal, natural and healthy emotional and internal experience for us to have, and one that we don't necessarily want to just get rid of very quickly. Boredom is where things like creativity can spark from. I love hearing Anna talk about all her hobbies because that sounds really quite creative in the way that she's applying her boredom. But it's also when our mind is quiet, a different network in the brain is activated, and that's the default mode network. And this is really important for self-referential processing and thinking. It's the kind of inner voice that helps us process our sense of self, our sense of identity, who we are in the world, the life that we want to live, etc. So it's actually really important for us to have that quiet time.
Has modern technology changed the way we cope with boredom, or that kind of discomfort in nothingness?
Yeah, I would say absolutely. Technology and the accessibility of tech and screens and so many things means it's very easy for us to just take ourselves away from that feeling of boredom. And in the moment, that might feel good, but what that means, particularly kind of for younger generations growing up in this day and age, is that they don't necessarily get to build that skill of frustration tolerance and being able to sit with that uncomfortable feeling. And the reality is that we can't always in life escape uncomfortable emotions and experiences. So we actually do need to work on building the skill to be able to be present with those experiences.
Zoe, you have ADHD. You've done dopamine detoxes. What does that involve?
So I've done 2 now. They're 30 days. I read a book called The Dopamine Nation, and she recommended a 30-day dopamine detox to really reset everything. And so I did 30 days the first time with no scrolling, no sugar, obviously, no online shopping or any non-essential shopping, no games, no TV series, so anything that could hook your attention. And I was really bored for the first week.
Really?
I was like deathly bored, like kill me now, I'm so bored.
Wow.
It was so bad.
Did it highlight how big your cravings were?
Yes, and actually the sugar cravings went pretty quickly, but I was so surprised about, like, my hands were almost like please pick up the phone and play a game. It was like actual, like, physical to do something dopamine in. Took so much willpower.
What did you do instead?
Well, the first week I was just like, wow, I'm so bored. And I had prepped, because obviously I couldn't do any non-essential shopping. So I had bought some crafts and things. I thought, oh, like that'd be fun to do that. But I couldn't even bring myself to do that the first week. But then the second week I started to kind of like tap into my more creative spirit. So I'm a creative person, but I found that when my dopamine is being stolen on a frequent basis, that kind of falls to one side. So I created some pretty large abstract art pieces. I learned to macro weave, which is macrame and weaving together. And it did definitely reset everything, and probably I was off TikTok for about 6 months. I've never played solitaire since. I don't dare. I'm like, no. I've got other games that have come in, but yeah, I've just kind of gone through that process. And then about 2 years later, I did it again, and I would say I'm due again right now. Like the cravings are coming back, and so it's like I'm very aware that it's time.
Anastasia, are dopamine detoxes effective?
They can be, depends how they're done. So dopamine detoxes did the rounds on social media, and there was certainly a lot of sensationalization around them. They were kind of sold sometimes as these like 24-hour quick fixes. So 24 hours, no music, no socializing, no tasty food, like nothing that could be fun at all. You have this really kind of boring 24 hours. You push through and you come out the other end. Of course, 24 hours of most things is not enough time to actually create any sort of long-lasting, meaningful change. So if we are talking to someone about taking a period of abstinence or taking a break from something, we're typically recommending around 1 month. But that said, if someone has somewhat more of an addictive tendency to something that is much more intense, it can sometimes take up to 3 months or more for the brain to kind of recalibrate and come back to a level of homeostasis. Those first 1 to 3 months is where we see most people will experience the most intense cravings and urges. And so when we're working with someone who's in the process of addiction recovery, if they get to that point, we're really celebrating it, because that's when they start to come out the other end of having those very intense and strong craving and urges.
Talia, you used ice for 10 years. How did you overcome that addiction?
I was incarcerated on 3 separate occasions prior to my final term of incarceration. So that was in 2018. And after a while of realising that I wasn't getting out, I started to seek out like therapy and some things to do while incarcerated. So you're sitting in a cell that's 2 by 4 metres for 22 hours a day with nothing to do. You soon realise that you have to start to look inwards and work on yourself and do something, because I didn't want to go back there. And so after a few months, I started to seek out therapy. So looking at how I regulate my emotions, because that's what really led me to start using drugs in the first place, was I wasn't very good at regulating my emotions. And whenever I felt something that was distressing or stressful, I would go straight to risk-taking behaviour, which obviously led to the drugs, and really doing some self-work and working out what it is that I want from life. And yeah, that's what I did.
During your rehab, did you ever wonder if a full recovery was possible?
Yeah, I had always heard, you know, that when you use ice, it pretty much kills the dopamine receptors in your brain. And certainly for the first little while, you feel like you're never going to feel joy or happiness or good or whole again. It feels really empty and it's really scary. And I didn't know for a long time if ever I was going to feel happy again. But yeah, slowly but surely, I got to feel the full range of emotions. So joy and happiness, but also, you know, anxiety and sadness. And I hadn't cried for everything that had happened within those 10 years for the whole 10 years. And so, yeah, crying for the first time and not being able to stop. And so, yeah, being able to feel the full range of emotions, not just being able to feel happy or joy again.
What brings you joy today?
My kids, their laugh brings me so much joy. Also doing the work that we do, like that I do now, going back into women's prisons and seeing the light turn on for women, that is a dopamine hit for me. That brings me so much joy. Hiking, good food, and just being around people who like love me, which is, yeah, really joyful.
Thank you so much. And thank you to you all for being here. That's all we've got time for. Thank you too for your company. I'll see you next time.